corrupt system to just go in and put the Band-Aids in the right places and sweep the floor, and it just seems so superficial. I want to get your commentary on it.
Yeah, a lot of times when we're talking about police brutality and police corruption, people love to say it's a few bad apples, but it's not a few bad apples. And when you look at the murder of George Floyd, what was equally striking to the fact that Derek Chauvin kept his knee on Floyd's neck, despite his begging for his life for almost 9 minutes, 3 other police officers stood there and watched and did nothing. And they did nothing while people around them were begging them to stop this. And so that's a system that cannot be rehabilitated. In Buffalo, New York, a police officer shoved a 75-year-old man who fell, started bleeding, and the rest of the unit just continued to walk by and left this old man to bleed. He went, and then his injuries were severe enough that he had to go to the hospital and spend the night. And then when the police officers were suspended with pay, the 57 members of that riot unit quit rather than have to face that their colleague faced consequences for something that is categorically terrible. No matter what your political affiliation is, like, you look at that and you just think, that's fucked up. And so, again, the system is corrupt. These people have bought into the rhetoric of Blue Lives Matter. And so we have to start over. And people hear defund the police and they hear prison and police abolition and they think that law enforcement disappears. No, but we have to rethink what law enforcement looks like. We have to demilitarize law enforcement. And so I think it's time to get radical. And I'll tell you what, before George Floyd's murder, I was very skeptical of prison and police abolition because I just thought, how? And I recognize now that it was a failure of my imagination. And all of us who just get flummoxed by the idea of abolition, people also didn't understand slavery abolition. And that was also a failure of imagination. And so I'm doing right now, this is not my area of expertise, so I'm actually reading as much as I can and just trying to educate myself on what this might look like and how we can safely go about it. But I think we can do it. I think that the police cause more harm than the good they do. And, I don't want to be afraid every time I get in a car and leave my house that I'm going to get pulled over. I'm not, which is fine, but then die because a cop thinks that I'm going to do something, which I'm not. It's just, I shouldn't have to live like that. I shouldn't have to worry about my brothers. I shouldn't have to worry about my dad. And so we have to start over, and I hope that we can.
Thank you. As a eternal optimist, and having seen protests and there are markers across the last 30 years, something feels different to me. I don't know what it is, not being Black or a person of color. As an ally, what is different about this? It feels different from the outside. I don't know if it feels different from where you are. I'm curious what your perception is of the current moment. Is it different? And if so, why?
I don't know yet. I think it's too soon to tell. I want to believe that it's different, but I also wanted to believe it was going to be different after the Charleston 9 were murdered. And I wanted to believe it was going to be different after Trayvon Martin and Michael Brown and Tamir Rice, 9 years old, or 12 years old. I mean, regardless, he was a child. So each time this happens, I think, okay, this is going to be the tipping point. But when Tamir Rice wasn't the tipping point, when a child who was playing with a toy gun, minding his own little business in a park, was murdered by a cop, first of all, cops are cowards because they are forever shooting unarmed Black people out of fear. But if that wasn't the tipping point, nothing will be, in the same way that Sandy Hook wasn't the tipping point on rethinking gun legislation. Like when upper middle class white children are murdered, like children, 6 and 7 year olds, then no, we're never going to change in this country. So I don't know. I'm not an optimist. I'm a realist. And I don't know. But I do see this time what's different. Corporations are at least paying lip service to the idea that Black Lives Matter. People who have been racist are facing material consequences for their behavior. It's like the Me Too movement, but with consequences. And um, white people are getting on board. Like white people are like, this one was so horrific that even white people are like, oh man, that one was actually pretty bad. So I do think if there ever was an opportunity to capitalize on the sacrifice of a Black person, it would be this moment. And so I really, really hope that we are on the precipice of real change, because as a writer who engages with social justice and who writes about the world that we live in and looks at race and gender and things like that, I'm just tired of writing about Black people who have been murdered in deeply unjust ways. And so I do hope that this is that moment. We'll see.
Thank you. My optimist is coming back here to ask another question. Let's say we make a change in policing. We, as you invoked your imagination, we invoke that imagination as a culture, as a society. We run some experiments. Some of these early cities that are ahead of the curve on divesting and reinvesting, divesting and reinvesting in a community that is beyond just the militarization of the police. Mm-hmm. Let's say we achieve some of these things. Let's say from the current standard to something that's more decentralized or community service driven. What is the next area of the public focus for anti-racism? Where ought we focus if we can see progress with the policing?
Well, I mean, it has to be more than just policing. We also have to look at the court system, which disproportionately punishes Black people. Mm-hmm. We have to release every single person who is arrested for marijuana crimes immediately. I think we have to overhaul the prison system. Until we deal with those things, nothing else is going to matter. And it has to be done immediately. This is not something that has to be rolled out slowly. I think that private prisons must be abolished. They are corrupt and they are predicated on locking up Black people so that they can make more money. And so those are like immediate things that can be done, and they can be done realistically. Because, yeah, we can get rid of private prisons. That's an easy, well, nothing is easy, but that's also an easy thing to do. And then we have to look at the education system, and we have to look at the fact that Black children are disproportionately disciplined in the classrooms. We have to get rid of charter schools. We have to separate tax base in land. We have to separate real estate tax from the school system.
Schools, yeah.
So that funds are more evenly distributed. So, like, people in Beverly Hills basically receive a private education in their public schools because of that tax base, while people in Crenshaw have a much lower tax base, and therefore their public schools are doing less with more. I mean, they're having to do more with less. And so we have to just equalize the public school system. I think some of these things will begin to get at systemic problems. And it's just going to require a lot of imagination from elected officials and also from ourselves. I think a lot of us are going to have to be made uncomfortable. I'm uncomfortable by some of these ideas, but that's because I was raised in a racist world. And I have to sort of decolonize my thinking, and we all do.
Speaking of decolonize the thinking and maybe in a where do we go from here, media literacy is a huge topic, and I think whether you look at the last election, the platforms that we're communicating on right now, the availability that's something that both gives everyone a voice and then is something you can pay to play to be everywhere. What advice would you give around media literacy if that's a huge piece of the problem that we face as a culture and as an audience of creators and entrepreneurs who I think can stand to, certainly be harmed by the media, but also maybe help shape it?
Yeah,
What advice would you give for media literacy?
I think media literacy is one of the most important skills we can teach anyone. And I think that media literacy begins in preschool in age appropriate ways, where we teach children about the messages that they consume and adults also, but we can start with kids because we have to understand the motivations behind a commercial for example, right now, media literacy is at an all-time important level because a lot of corporations are putting out nonsense commercials praising themselves and telling us that we're in this together. Sorry, Chase Bank. No, we're not in this together because you want my mortgage payment. So, we're definitely not in this together. Um, and
Disclosure: my name has no connection to the Chase Bank. Just
it's just really frustrating. Amazon, who refuses to pay their workers a living wage, refuses to give them personal protection equipment, is having all these commercials about how well they're taking care of their employees. It's just like media literacy lets us know that they're full of shit. And I really think it's important that we understand that so that we don't get taken in. And we don't make assumptions about corporate entities doing good. They're not doing good. They're only concerned with protecting their bottom line. And so these things matter. We have to understand the messages that we receive through film and television, even through books. And so I just encourage everyone to become media literate, especially because we have a president who calls everything that he disagrees with fake news. He calls facts fake news. He doesn't believe in science. And so when there's no coherent federal leadership, and we're in the middle of a pandemic, media literacy goes a really long way to making sure that we understand that it's actually not safe to go outside without protection. And so perhaps you should do something about that. I keep seeing people just flagrantly walking around without masks, and I'm just like, oh my God, you guys, what are you doing? It's a lot, and I live in a really liberal place, so. Ugh.
yeah, hence the question like about media literacy, is it's such a huge area of both fear and opportunity. I think the fact that the media that we are experiencing right now is something that no one has training for. No, it basically appeared on us in what felt like, in generational terms overnight. There's so much opportunity there for educating. And it's not just the young people, right?
And, as creators, I think that we have a responsibility to make sure that we're creating ethical art. And it doesn't mean like you have to be a saint, like be an asshole, talk about terrible things, whatever. But when you're creating messages for the public, at least make sure that they're honest and that they're grounded in fact and that they understand that the world is round. These things matter. And we have that responsibility, I believe.
Speaking of responsibility, and honesty, I've heard you described as radically honest. Is that something you would you own that, or is that a moniker that somebody stuck on you?
I'm not radically honest. I'm honest, but I think people consider it radical because I tell truths that they are uncomfortable with. Like people always call things that they're uncomfortable with radical, like $15 an hour minimum wage. Oh, that's radical. That's because you don't want to pay someone $15 an hour. It's not radical. It really isn't. And so I do think people call me that. I understand where it comes from, but I think it's just that I'm willing to talk about things that make people uncomfortable.
In your TED Talk,
Mm-hmm.
you said a lot of truth. You spoke a lot of honesty about feminism. I was deeply inspired, and the way that is just such an elegant crafting of the message, using yourself as a lens through which you could look at being good or bad at feminism. I'm wondering if you could talk about that either through the lens of feminism or anything, your ability to put yourself in harm's way in your own story, and it's just it's genius. And I'm trying to find out. You've done it in so many of the works that I've read, and that's the part where I asked early on, like, how do you craft your own narrative? Is it starting from in here, or is it starting from out there? And maybe this is back to a creative process question, but where does your ability or your that piece of art that you put yourself again in the is in the bad seat for long enough? Is it just is it a device? You're so articulate with it, and it's so well done in your TED talk. Can you talk to us about it?
Um, I mean, it's a rhetorical strategy. People always think, oh, you're so raw, which they always say about Black writers. It's really aggravating. It's like, no, it's not raw. I have a PhD in communication. I made you feel that way. And so it's a choice. It's definitely a rhetorical choice to get the reaction I want out of the reader. Um, so I always think about craft and what craft choices I can make to bring about a certain response in my readers. And it's not about manipulation, it really is about persuasion. And how do I get my readers to consider my point of view? And sometimes it requires not sacrifice, but a willingness to open myself up. And I do it despite being afraid to do it. I just do it anyway. It's not bravery. It's not special. I just do it and I'm terrified at the same time. And so far it has worked. And, it gets harder and harder to do because it's easy to do when no one's reading your work. So the way I got to do it was I always told myself, it doesn't matter what you put in this book. Literally, no one's going to read it. You write about feminism and Black people, like no one's going to care. And it's getting harder to maintain that delusion as I become more successful. And so it's also getting harder to be vulnerable on the page. But I try to do it when a piece necessitates it.
How?
I just tell myself this is what the piece needs and no one's going to read it. I literally still tell myself no one's going to read it.
No one's going to read your New York Times bestseller.
Yeah, not at all.
It's just, never heard of it.
Who?
Who? So let's get on to self-care. I watch your Twitter feed, your Instagram feed, and I see you baking these croissants. And your cooking photos and videos are amazing. I think I just one fan from across the country. You should do a cookbook. It would be incredible. But what do you do for self-care, for burnout, for other creative outlets that are not your day job? Is that something that you feel like you need? You talked earlier about writing being joyful and relaxing, and it seems like you have so many creative hobbies or engaged in all this other stuff outside of writing. And I'm curious if you could help us understand, is that intentional? Is that just, part of your personality? What about this? Is it managing self-care and burnout, or what is it?
I don't really think in terms of self-care because I'm old, but I do think it's important, and I'm not very good at it, and I need to get better at it because I'm burnt out, but I also have a lot of obligations. So, those obligations don't care about burnout. Like my parents' mortgage does not care. So I have to suck it up and do what needs to be done. I have a lot of hobbies because I'm a Libra, and I'm always interested in a lot of different things. And I'm not super woo astrology, but I do believe in my sign, and I am very, very Libra. I have 5 of 6 areas or houses in Libra, and so I'm like a Libra. And
deep Libra.
And baking is relaxing. I love baking. It's precise, but it's also creative, and it's challenging at times. Like I'm trying to master croissant, which are very, very hard to make, and I have not yet mastered them, but I will. And it's just I enjoy the process of doing it, and it's okay if I fuck it up. It's like there's nothing at stake. It's just me, and my partner will eat it anyway. She doesn't care, and she'll
I've
tell
seen pictures